Of Sciencia's 2021-22 lecture series. We're delighted you're with us in person, online, having a little bit of technical difficulty, so you'll see the slides, but you may not be able to see the speakers. Apologize about that. I'm Anthony Brand. I'm a professor of composition and theory at the Shepherd School of Music and director of Scientia. Each year, Scientia brings together outstanding Rice faculty to examine broad themes that transcend disciplines. This year, we're celebrating and exploring some of the vast interconnectedness that animates nature and human life. Today, we're honored to present Professors Ashley Leeds and Dunn. Let me take off my mask, actually. Ashley Leeds is Ratifying Professor of Political Science and Chair of the Department of Political Science at Rice University. Professor Leeds' research focuses on the design and effects of international agreements and also on connections between domestic politics and foreign policy. Much of her work has concentrated on the area of security cooperation, particularly military alliances. In 2008, Leeds was awarded the Karl Deutsch Award by the International Studies Association, presented annually to a scholar early in her career who is judged to have made the most significant published contributions to the study of international relations and peace research. In 2019, Leeds won the Lifetime Achievement Award from the Conflict Processes section of the American Political Science Association in recognition of scholarly contributions that have fundamentally improved the study of conflict processes. She served as president of the International Studies Association during 2017-18 and president of the Peace Studies Society during 2018-19. Amy Dunham is an associate professor of ecology and evolutionary biology in the Department of Biosciences at Rice University. Dr. Dunham is a tropical ecologist with a focus on rainforest ecosystems in Madagascar and Central Africa. Her research addresses the impacts of anthropogenic pressures, including climate change, biodiversity loss, and habitat fragmentation on species interactions and ecosystem processes in tropical forests. Dr. Dunham has served as a coordinating lead author on the African Regional Report for the UN-backed Intergovernmental Science Platform for Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, which I almost said in one breath, from 2015 to 2018. She is an elected council member of the Association for Tropical Biology and Conservation and is serving as a coordinating fellow and research committee member of the Pan-African Scientific Research Council. I'm sure these are going to be two fascinating talks. Each speaker will speak for about 20 to 25 minutes, and then we'll have 10 minutes for questions. And for those in person, we cordially invite you to a reception out in the lobby. Please keep an eye out for our spring series, which will include 2 more faculty presentations and the annual Bachner Lecture, which this year features Merlin Sheldrake, author of the marvelous book Entangled Life, about fungi and mycelial networks, which may be the most extensive interconnected life form on Earth. Now, please join me in welcoming Professor Leeds. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. It's definitely a pleasure to be here, and I'm especially excited to be here alongside Amy and talk about 2 really important issues in current international affairs. What I'm going to talk about today is how countries manage their connections to each other. And I'm going to talk first in general about how we can think about that problem, and then focus on a particularly timely issue, which is the management of military alliances by the United States. So countries in the world are legally sovereign. And what that means is that the national government within any territory is the highest law. So there's no law above the country. At the same time, countries are connected to each other. Oops, my slide didn't move, did it? Nothing's moving. There we go. Is it double click? I guess.
I don't remember.
Okay, we'll see if I can get it this time. So anyway, we've got countries that are legally sovereign, but they're connected to each other in a variety of ways that require coordinated policies and actions. So, for example, example, people, goods, and information move around the world more than ever they have before. And at the same time, many current threats don't stop at borders. For instance, climate change and pandemics. So what that means is that countries have incentives to figure out how to cooperate for mutual gain. And they often do this by building organizations, but they also regulate their interactions through treaties. Treaties are a form of international law that exists between rather than above countries. Countries choose to constrain their own future behavior in order to achieve the benefits of mutual cooperation. So treaties are negotiated internationally among leaders, but they're often ratified through some domestic political process and become part of domestic law in the participating countries. The problem is, one might wonder why simply writing things down on a piece of paper and signing them would matter. And in fact, on the eve of World War I, German Chancellor Bethmann Hollweg referred to the guarantee of Belgian neutrality as a mere scrap of paper, and wondered why Great Britain would possibly go to war over such a document. So a lot of international relations research, and my research in particular, has investigated why and under what conditions treaties influence behavior and thus influence international outcomes. So a lot of my research is focused specifically on a particular type of treaty, military alliances. And these are formal agreements between countries aimed at combating military threats. Many of the conclusions that I report today are based on a collection of what I hope is close to the population of military alliances that were signed between countries in the world between 1815 and 2018. We've collected 765 such alliances. So why do states form alliances? States build strength by aggregating their capabilities, and they gain from economies of scale in the provision of defense. So in the end, when states band together and promise to help each other in the event of conflict, they create a stronger joint military force. This can deter adversaries from initiating conflicts, and if conflicts occur, can help them win wars when they have to fight. A lot of times, however, strong states, like the US, form alliances with much weaker powers, many of which are unlikely to make a difference in their own defense. So why does that make sense? Well, first of all, the strong state may do this because it has an interest in the weak state's security. I'm referring to this as tied fates. It could be due to economic interests, it could be a desire to deny an important potential ally to an adversary, it could be concerns about potential negative consequences of conflict like refugee flows. Second, the strong state may trade promises of defense in return for other concessions. So for example, the other state may provide support for foreign policy initiatives, use of territory for military bases, economic advantages, etc. And third, allies get a place at the bargaining table. Even when war does not occur, allies have the ability to influence the outcome of bargaining processes between allies and potential adversaries. They can, for instance, tell an ally, if you won't accept a deal that I think is good, I won't support you in war. And at the same time tell the adversary, if you don't accept a deal I think is good, I will participate in this war. The well-known problem with alliances, however, is a time inconsistency issue. How can members assure one another that if war occurs, they're later going to fulfill their commitments? Credibility of alliances depends on incentives to pay significant costs in the future. So at this time, I may make a deal with you and say, you know what, if either of us is attacked, we're going to work together. But in the future, when you're attacked, am I really going to send my people to war? The main thing that makes commitments credible is the value of future cooperation. So alliances are formed because both sides, at the time they form it, see it as valuable. And if you violate it now, it's likely going to end. So as long as the alliance remains an equilibrium choice as initially designed, it should remain credible. Both sides will want to continue to support it. This could be in the case of the strong and weak states that we just talked about, because the strong power has an interest in the state needing defense, as in the tide fates rationale, or it could be because the linked issues are very valuable to the strong state. This doesn't necessarily mean that alliances have no effect and only formalize what would have happened anyway. In fact, the coordination that happens through the formation and maintenance of the alliance can change incentives to work together later. So for example, military bases or peacetime military coordination can change the probability that you can win wars together. They can change the costs of fighting together, the economic ties that you create, and the foreign policy support that you create can increase your interest in defending a power in the future. Now, we also know that ratifying treaties makes them part of domestic law, and it changes public and elite support for action. So a number of survey experiments have shown that the public approves more highly of actions in support of past commitments in international law. We also know that violating commitments make potential future allies less willing to form alliances with you and more likely to demand better terms. In my view, this domestic legalization and reputation matter. They make a difference. But I see it more as putting a thumb on a scale rather than the factors that are doing the heavy lifting. I think that reputation and legalization affect decisions at the margins, but they're more likely to work in concert with calculations of political and strategic value rather than instead of them. At the margins, though, these considerations can be very important. So what we can conclude is that because of the material and political costs associated with forming, maintaining, and violating alliances, forming an alliance provides credible information to partners and potential adversaries about the future behavior of allies. So do alliances work? In short, yes. My past research has shown that potential targets with allies are less likely to face demands backed by the threat of military force. Basically, potential allies are less likely to ask for concessions from states when they expect them to have support from external allies. What that means is that defense pacts are a stabilizing force in international politics. They're status quo biased. They create more peace and stability. Now, whether this is normatively valuable, I think most people think avoiding death and avoiding destruction is normatively valuable. But whether we're pleased with the status quo and we don't want the distribution of benefits to change is a normative question. That being said, for the US, which currently is the strongest state in the system and clearly benefits from the current distribution of benefits, there's no question that the status quo and peace and stability are valuable. So there used to be a time 10 years ago or so, 15 years ago, where when I would give these talks, people would ask me if, given the decline of interstate war, alliances were even necessary anymore. And in response, I often got to paraphrase the great Ruth Bader Ginsburg. When she talked about this, she was talking about voting rights, but to paraphrase her, believing that alliances are unnecessary because interstate war has declined is like throwing away your umbrella in a rainstorm because you're not getting wet. So the US currently has lots of alliance commitments, focusing specifically on defense pacts where the US has promised to come to the military aid of states who are attacked. The US is allied to most of Europe through NATO, most of Latin America through the OAS, plus Australia, Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, Pakistan, and Thailand. And other than the expansion of NATO, these commitments have been relatively unchanged since the early years of the Cold War. As I said, the US benefits enormously from the stability provided by the current world order. And so this web of US alliances is one of the things that maintains this stability. So Donald Trump arrived on the scene, and he immediately began to publicly question the value of these long-standing US alliances. One might wonder if there are clearly such benefit to the US, according to scholars, why would that be? Well, I've also done a lot of research about why alliances end. And in general, alliances end when they fall out of equilibrium because the interests of the members change. And this can be due to international changes, or it can be due to domestic changes. So internationally, the key changes that we would look for would be changes in international power or changes in international threat. Of course, there have been significant changes in both since most of these US alliances were formed. Remember, I said most of them were formed at the beginning of the Cold War. So one can understand why many scholars predicted an end to alliances in the 1990s. The removal of the Soviet threat and the ushering in of unipolarity was seen as making alliances less important. But the US didn't walk away from their alliances then. Alternatively, one might think that hegemonic decline makes maintaining worldwide commitments too difficult for the United States. Yet the US remains the most powerful military and economic country in the world, and many argue that investments in institutions enhance rather than reduce that power. Finally, one might argue that the rise of China and a new great power competition would cause the US to rethink its alliance strategy. But that would seem to suggest a change in alliance emphasis, perhaps moving from Europe to Asia, rather than undermining alliances all over the world. Internal political changes matter also, we argue. In a new book with Michaela Matas that's coming out in January, I argue that domestic politics determines the purpose to which foreign policy power is put. And when the domestic societal interests with influence on leaders change, foreign policy may change also. We find strong evidence of this across 4 different foreign policy issue areas: alliances, UN voting, economic sanctions, and trade. Trump seems to have created a somewhat new domestic coalition in the US. The biggest difference between Trump voters and Romney voters was in whites without a college degree. Before 2016, there was little difference between Republicans and Democrats in education level, but in the 2016 election, Republican voters were less well educated. In a knowledge-based economy, education is related to economic opportunity. We know that those less likely to compete well economically on the global stage prefer more isolationist policies. Thus, the interests of less well-educated workers in a platform of economic nationalism and populism for the United States is not surprising. The foreign policy preferences of this group may differ both from that of previous Republican Party base and also that of the traditional Democratic Party base, groups that had different foreign policy preferences but both favored an international stance. As a side note, hegemonic decline may well have influence on the rise of this domestic coalition. So international factors are not irrelevant to this change, but in my view, the international factors are working through domestic politics, not on their own. An extremely robust finding in my work with Mattis is that while changes in domestic coalitions are associated with foreign policy change, and generally when we get a change in coalitions, people want to do something different, the effect is much stronger in non-democracies than in democracies. In fact, over a 100-year period looking at all countries in the world, we find no statistically significant relationship between leadership changes that bring to power different interests in democracy and foreign policy changes. But we do find such an influence in non-democracies, both specifically in the area of alliance termination and in most of the other issue areas we examine. So why is it that democracies exhibit more stable foreign policies? We think there are 2 aspects to democracy that limit the effect of these interest changes on foreign policy change. One has to do with incentives to appeal to a broader range of interests in society, and the other has to do with constraints on the ability of leaders to change policy unilaterally. Trump talked big about alliances. He talked a lot about ending them, and yet he didn't end any of them. In fact, Congress and other actors acted preemptively to make that very difficult. So there were other actors that constrained what Trump was able to do, even when his coalition may have preferred them. The problem is, even if alliances don't formally end, perceptions that the incentives of US presidents have changed matter a lot. Uncertainty is dangerous in international politics. Maintaining commitments while raising questions about whether they provide value is problematic if you accept my earlier premise that the main thing that makes commitments credible over time is belief in the value of future cooperation. Trump said he wanted to get a better deal for the US. He understands that taking a tough bargaining stand requires that one indicate that he or she is willing to walk away. That's where the bargaining power comes from. Why would anyone agree to revising terms if they didn't believe you were willing to walk away? So why shouldn't the US step back and take a less active role and demand that allies bear more of a burden? The problem is that if allies lose faith that the US sees value in future cooperation, international law and reputation alone, they aren't enough to create credibility. That doesn't mean that allies won't work with the US at all. Frankly, they don't have a lot of great substitutes, and that's why Trump was so surprised and confused why the US didn't have a strong bargaining advantage. But allies will hedge. They'll seek different alliances. They'll build their own military capabilities so they can have more independence. And as the future value perceived by allies of the US commitment declines, allies become less rather than more likely to accommodate the US through issue linkage, or through accommodating US bargaining positions in crises, or by paying more for the defense that seems less likely to be provided. I have prior work that shows that how much a potential target state depends on its ally influences how much the target accommodates the allies' preferences in bargaining. We also know that allies that provide more defensive support gain more concessions in alliance bargaining, and that when reliability is questioned, allies demand better terms. So in this case, attempts to create a better bargain in the short term hurt US bargaining power in the long term. Attempting to revise alliance terms by convincing partners that you gain little from cooperation is either not credible in the short run, making it a failed strategy, or successful in the short run, but damaging in the long run, as partners work to find substitutes given concerns about reliability. So where do we go from here? What does the future hold? First, in the short run, Biden is working hard to reassure allies, not only through his words, although a lot through words, but also through taking actions. Whether that can be successful likely depends on whether the Trump coalition is here to stay. If US allies believe that future leaders may also have to respond to a coalition that sees little value in US engagement and doesn't value the prime seat at the bargaining table that these alliance commitments get them, then they won't feel comfortable counting on the US, and the US will become weaker, and the US alliances will become weaker and more costly. The other concern is the fragility of democracy. In the last chapter of our book, we talk about how polarization and democratic backsliding can undermine the foreign policy consistency that helps democracies in building international cooperation and effective deterrence. So the US gains great influence in the international system and serves as a stabilizing force through its web of alliances. To the extent that domestic actors no longer see benefit in that influence, given the cost that they believe they pay for it, allies have every reason to worry, and the international system will change. To the extent that major powers move away from democracy, we need to worry not only about the stability of our domestic system, but the international system as well. Thank you.
Great presentation and for starting today's seminar about connections. The kinds of connections that I'm going to be talking about are a little different. I would like you to imagine yourself exploring a natural ecosystem. Perhaps you're walking through a forest or snorkeling through coral reef. In these cases, if you imagine a forest, you would probably be thinking about being surrounded by tall, shade-giving trees. If you imagined a coral reef, you may have been thinking about snorkeling through a diverse array of beautiful, colorful fish. The organisms you imagine are important and even foundational parts of these ecosystems, but there's a lot more going on than what you see as you walk or swim through a natural ecosystem. You see, each of these ecosystems is made up of and relies on a fantastic and dizzyingly complex set of connections. Darwin famously referred to these connections in the ecological realm as the tangled bank. He imagined looking at a tangled bank of a stream, clothed with many kinds of plants, insects flitting about, birds singing on the bushes, worms crawling through the damp earth, all interconnected through many complex pathways. Ecosystems are made up of connections between species, between populations, connecting individuals, and connecting organisms with their physical environments. And through these dynamic connections, you have flows of energy and nutrients, networks of movement and information that can flow across a landscape. And in ways that you would likely miss during a stroll through a forest or a swim through a coral reef. Today, I want to share with you a few of the fascinating ways that connections exist in nature. How nature connects deeply with people's livelihoods and well-being, even when we are unaware of it. And I'll also give some thoughts about how scientists are realizing that we need different scales and patterns of connections between people to avoid losing the benefits that nature provides through its diversity and through its connection with us. As a rainforest ecologist, I study the connections in a diverse forested ecosystems. But I've been fascinated by nature's connections for a very long time. I grew up around the forests of the Adirondack Mountains of New York, and as a child I would spend hours of my free time climbing trees, mucking around ponds with a fish net, and just observing nature. When I was 10, my county's Soil Conservancy and the National Wildlife Federation went to the schools and asked the K-12 students to submit artwork to represent how wildlife depends on soils. That was probably the first time that I really thought deeply about how organisms might interact and connect with each other and with their environment, both above and below the ground. And I'm proud to say that I won first prize. Fast forward 18 years, and I've gotten a PhD studying the intimate connections linking plants and animals above ground with the fauna and microbes and the physical environment below ground in a complex tropical forest. Studies had shown that insectivorous birds and mammals living in the understory of rainforests were often some of the first animals to drop out of ecosystems as the forest became small and fragmented. These are generally small, brown forest critters that conservation biologists don't often think about. But my work showed how the loss of these otherwise rather drab creatures resulted in a trophic cascade affecting links spanning 4 different levels of interactions. The loss of these insectivores and their connections in a food web created an understory that was teeming with spiders and with insect pests that devoured seedlings to the ground, thwarting regeneration of trees for the next generation. And with more spiders eating springtails and other little insects than the leaf litter, decomposition was altered. And limiting nutrients got tied up in these vast mats of microbes and fungi in the soil. I did further work to show that when this happens, it alters the chemistry of the leaves in the trees, reflecting the changing nutrients that were available in the soil. In turn, the altered nutrients of the leaves can alter a plant's ability to defend themselves. Plant-eating insects faced with altered nutrient ratios of leaves may also need to adjust their intakes to meet the stoichiometric balance of nutrients in their bodies. So many fascinating and important connections that can change in the face of biodiversity loss, even in those creatures that we may think may be less important. So the ways species connect to each other through positive and negative interactions underlies functioning of ecosystems. Sometimes these connections between species are cooperative and positive for all the interacting partners, and we call these mutualistic interactions. Virtually all species on Earth, including humans, are involved in one or more mutualistic interaction. For example, nearly 85% of plants rely on insects or other animals for pollination services. As bees move from flower to flower, they create connections between plants as they direct the flow of pollen. Similarly, a majority of trees in a rainforest rely on a mutualism with fruit-eating animals to disperse their seeds, as sort of gardeners of the forest. In Madagascar, one of the most diverse ecosystems in the world, we have traced networks of connections made by lemurs, which are fruit-eating primates, with the trees that they visit to forage. Lemurs connect fruit trees to other fruit trees through their movement as the hungry animals move from tree to tree to feed on fruits. The properties and shapes of the resulting web of lemur movements that is formed by hubs of activity and overlapping networks of movement determine which trees will have their seeds dispersed, where the seeds will go when they are eventually dropped as scat, and these networks that are dynamic from season to season end up forming the template of forest regeneration. Such networks have been used to explain the clustering of bird-dispersed fruiting trees, almost like small orchards that are commonly found in temperate forests. It helps explain why ancient wide canopy trees in forests pantropically, those trees that attract those large primates that eat a wide diversity of fruits, it explains why those trees are often surrounded by markedly more diverse regenerating neighborhoods of fruiting trees, compared to trees that do not attract these generalist primates. It means that where your seeds, if you're a tree, where your seeds are sown is not a random process that's often assumed in many forest growth models. But it relies on who your neighbors are. It relies on your position in the landscape and the connections that are made by your animal mutualists. As a result of these discoveries, forest restoration projects are actually starting to think about the implications of these types of networks. What arrangement and what tree species do plant in a restored patch to create a spatial network that will maximize the eventual flow of seeds sown by these birds and mammals who are charged with enhancing tree biodiversity and structuring the regeneration patterns of trees. The patterns of trees in the landscape has other implications as well that we are just beginning to understand. You see, trees have some secret connections that are even harder to detect. Walking through a temperate forest, and you would never notice that below your feet is an information highway made of infinite biological pathways and connections, transporting nutrients, water, chemicals, and information between individual trees and even between species with the help of ectomycorrhizal fungi. These fungi form intimate connections with tree roots while they exchange carbon for other nutrients with the trees. They connect tree root to tree root through this vast underground network, sometimes referred to as the wood wide web. Trees are not just competing with each other, but sometimes they're actually communicating with each other about pests and about pathogens, and they can respond to that communication by upping their defenses, so they're cooperating in many cases. Studies have even shown that a dying mother tree may shunt her nutrients and resources underground that end up going preferentially to her offspring. Scientists are still trying to understand how trees do this and how they use these connections. But with this web of communication and flow of materials between individuals and species, it means a forest can behave almost as a single organism through these connections. So I've talked a lot about connections in nature, but nature also has deep connections to us. in the urbanized parts of the world, we've become so far removed from nature and the diversity of living things that we've actually forgotten how much we're actually connected to it, how we use it, and how it affects us in our daily lives, and how seriously we will be affected by its loss. I began thinking about these connections much more deeply after I was invited to be part of the Intergovernmental Platform for Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services starting in 2015. This is an international body of biologists, economists, and social scientists that was tasked with summarizing and translating science and informing policymakers of UN member nations about the state and trends of biodiversity crises and at both regional and at global scales, and elucidating some of the many ways that biodiversity connects with human health, livelihoods, and well-being. This science policy platform was formed because we're understanding more and more that the diversity of living things and their connections to humans with our own linguistic and cultural diversity have key implications for our health and well-being. No matter who we are, rich or poor, no matter where we live, our well-being is dependent on the way that ecosystems work. Ecosystems provide us with essential materials for our daily lives, such as food, wood, fiber, and medicines, ideas for innovations. The presence of healthy forests and wetlands can clean our waters and reduce the intensity of flooding, and which is something that's important for those of us who live in a place like Houston. And they can make us more resilient to a changing climate. Biodiversity covers not only the number of species, but also the number, abundance, and composition of genotypes, populations, species interactions and connections, the richness of various habitats and landscapes, and even the diversity of people and their languages and cultures. The degradation of nature and the loss of biodiversity has major implications for development, for poverty alleviation, and for our ability to cope and adapt to long-term climate change. Connections with nature can even contribute to our spiritual and mental well-being through cultural or religious significance, and the opportunities that nature provides us for recreation or just the enjoyment of nature. Research shows that spending time and connecting with diverse green spaces like you can find on our campus can even help us focus and be more productive and can improve our mental health. Just as we're beginning to gain an appreciation of nature's diverse connections to human health and well-being, we are reaching a critical point in human history, the Anthropocene, where biodiversity and habitat loss due to increased human use, climate change, and rampant development are unprecedented. Even before biodiversity is lost from an area, the many and various connections between species and individuals that make a healthy ecosystems, like some of the ones I was talking about earlier, are often the first to disappear. In eastern North America, for example, up to 87% of linkages between native plants and their original native pollinators have been lost. So even if the pollinators and plant species are still around, so invasive species and climate change alter these interactions between species, and they can change how ecosystems function. Changing links among interacting species is something that's often ignored in the context of global change, but it's something that's likely to be very important. The impacts of these lost connections and declining biodiversity on human health, livelihoods, and well-being are also uneven across communities, especially affecting minoritized communities and those who depend most on environmental resources, such as subsistence farmers and the rural poor. Emphasis that the Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services has placed on identifying the benefits from nature was intentional. If we are to ensure that policy decisions fully account for the value of nature and the biodiversity of human well-being, and it's important to make these links very clear. We also need to rethink the way we view our relationship with nature. There is this illusion, especially in richer countries, that the services provided by nature are unlimited, such as the water we drink, the products we use, the foods we eat, and the forests and coastal ecosystems we enjoy. We believe we can control and dictate nature with our technology and with our scientific advances, but humans are really just a species among many other species in connection with nature and dependent on the services we can provide. So a major challenge now is to not only understand the complexity of natural systems and how we connect to nature, but also to find more effective ways to conserve this diversity and connections in a rapidly changing world. There's a growing realization that the future of biodiversity is inseparable from maintaining our cultural diversity. So what we need is a paradigm shift in how we go about conservation. The idea is that we need an integrated framework that's focused both on people and on nature, recognizing links between the erosion of nature and the erosion of culture. Such a paradigm shift means valuing local and indigenous knowledge and traditional people without romanticizing them. And the shift really means not just providing a seat at our planning meetings, but asking humbly to learn and engage in their knowledge systems. Increasing inclusiveness and equity among knowledge systems and perspectives are likely to make global and regional efforts more effective and more legitimate. It will vastly increase the knowledge and information base we have, and the creativity and talent needed to solve some of these world's most difficult problems. The Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services has already included in their assessments an unprecedented effort to tap indigenous and local knowledge, but we can still do more and we can strive to do better. We need all the ideas we can get, and each location is different. The problems are different, and we will benefit from the diversity of approaches and the diversity of methods. We need to reestablish local involvement in our ecosystems, whether that's an urban forest or a native prairie. And without working to reconnect cultures with nature and having knowledge and investment from local and indigenous populations, the decades of work have shown that biodiversity interventions are unlikely to be sustainable. So nature is full of wonderfully complex connections that make ecosystems function, including in many fascinating ways that are still undiscovered. Nature and these connections are critical for human health and well-being. And while we are facing a global crisis in biodiversity loss, I will end by saying optimistically that I believe we are making progress in discovering how to connect to each other in meaningful and more inclusive ways to tackle these problems for the benefit of both people and of nature.
For two wonderful talks and beautifully addressed to our themes too. Now we'll open the floor for questions. Richard, yeah.
So I have a question for Amy. As you were talking, it struck me, how do we know when an environment is healthy? So if I take a look at the Rice campus, which you said, oh, that's great, I get to walk around and think lofty thoughts and all the greenery, and yet it seems that this is a pretty unhealthy environment in some ways. How would we know?
Well, I mean, I would say it kind of depends. I mean, I think things like urban forests, like we have on our campus, contribute a lot to biodiversity. It's not a healthy ecosystem compared to, a pristine forest, right? But Rice campus, for example, is a major flyway for all these migrating species, and it does pretty well, right? I mean, but you're right. How do you quantify what's a healthy environment and which connections are lost or like, and that depends on your priorities. If it's about maintaining biodiversity, maybe that's one way. If it's about maintaining services that nature provides to people, that's another way to look at health of the environment. So there are lots of different ways that we can think about an ecosystem being healthy, depending on what our priorities are for conserving it.
Yes.
So I'm interested in the connections between the talk on connections. So Ashley, I was wondering if you could tell us if you think the current alliance framework, global alliance framework, is well suited to tackle issues like decreasing biodiversity or global climate change, or if we would fundamentally need to rethink the way we do international relations to tackle those issues.
Yeah, so I think that the military alliance structure is not the structure that would be most suited to solving these problems. I think there are other structures that are making some progress, but facing a whole lot of challenges about in resolving these big collective action problems, right? That have distributional aspects and self-restraint aspects, right? What I'm sure of is that institutions are going to be really important to making any of those things work. So if we want to have success at achieving biodiversity, at achieving better environmental protection, those kinds of things, it's going to require countries to come together and be willing to sacrifice some of their freedom in order to constrain themselves and others. What I will say is that if the U.S. gives up its position of providing a lot of benefits to others, then it's going to be in a less strong position to demand concessions on other issues. So to the extent that we care about being leaders on things like climate change and asking others to make sacrifices, it becomes harder to do when we're not providing the things we can provide to them.
As a related follow-up question between the alliances and the biodiversity issues, from your 700 and some odd contracts, treaties that you've looked at, and the examples from that you've been analyzing, to what extent do conflicts over natural resources and kind of environmental issues influence these outcomes?
Yeah, so certainly resource conflicts are powerful. I mean, territorial conflicts, control over valuable resources is one of the main things that leads to disputes over land and territory and control, and are the things we're trying to prevent by guaranteeing security to others. It's also true that a lot of these alliances include promises for cooperation on other issues. I actually have a current student, Nick Coulomb, who's studying this, about the connections between these promises for other things that we want to accomplish and the guarantees for military security. And in some cases, things like the navigability of rivers and maintaining environmental protection are aspects that get considered.
Amy, how long has Madagascar been an island? And how quickly did lemurs develop?
So it's separated from the mainland about 80 million years ago, and about 50 million years ago, the first primate made the trip rafting over from Africa. So they've been, and the primates that are currently there, and there are about 105 different species, all went through this adaptive radiation from this one rafting event that happened 50 million years ago.
Amy, I'm wondering, it seems like part of the human problem is that our our social smoke alarm doesn't go off until the house is on fire. And when you see already on the horizon a problem that's going to be devastating, but it hasn't reached a critical point yet, and I know some of these have already reached critical points, but how do you get people aware of it? How do you get us to raise our awareness sooner?
I mean, that is definitely the big question. And I wish I knew the answer. I mean, all I can say is, communicating with the public, with the children, through research, communicating with policymakers. Hopefully that helps. But I don't have the answer to that, and I wish I did.
Can I comment on that also? Because I would say one of the things that I feel good about is the kind of work that Amy's doing. International organizations like the UN, one of the main things they do is try to set the agenda, right? And so what they do is bring in people like Amy and climate scientists and global health experts and have those people come to some kind of consensus that's credible to the international community and share that information with policymakers in a way that gets a lot of attention, right? Now, whether they choose to pay the cost to take action is a separate question that has a lot of other dynamics. But I will say that the fact that these institutions are bringing people like Amy to talk to world leaders is really an important step.
And Ashley, I have a question. So we're probably all watching on the news, President Biden meeting with Putin today, and the threat of NATO, but not military action, might be economic. As you're watching that as a scholar, what are you seeing that we don't?
Yeah, so I would say one of the things I think about a lot is the alternative world of Ukraine as a member of NATO versus Ukraine as not a member of NATO, right? And there were possibilities there. And I think that I think people look at this and say, oh my goodness, if Ukraine was a member of NATO, there's a higher probability that the US and Russia would go to war. And I think that's true. There's a higher probability that the US would end up in war with Russia, contingent on the fact that the same threats happened. And so I think when countries like the US make decisions about which alliance commitments to make, they have to keep in mind the risk that they're going to pay costs to go to war, but they also have to think how much they care about protecting the status quo in these instances. And so, to some extent, I think the right decision about what should happen in those kinds of instances depends on how much value the U.S. places on an independent Ukraine versus the small probability that they end up in war to protect that.
So do you think that if one compromises, NATO agrees not to have Ukraine become part of it, and then Russia is appeased, or what?
I don't think that's the big issue right now. I don't think realistically Ukraine is going to become a part of NATO right now. So I don't think that's actually on the table at this moment. I think any discussion of that is sort of a smokescreen for other things that people really care about. I do think that there was a possibility Ukraine could have joined earlier, and that would have had an effect on outcomes.
Well, if there are no more questions, thank you for two beautiful talks about our interdependency and connectedness in so many different aspects of life. And please join us to continue the conversation out in the lobby. Thank you so much.